Take 3. Welcome back to the Data Protection Diaries and welcome back to the vlog. Obviously we had a week off last week, not a week off completely, but a week off from the vlog because we were talking to Eduardo Istran from Hogan Lovells about the future of international data transfers. Now that was a very interesting discussion. If you are interested in that, make sure that you go and check it out and I'll pop the link up above there. But today we are not doing panel sessions, we're not doing coffees, we're not doing chats with people today. We are back to vlogging, and today we are talking about when and if you should be reporting a security incident to the regulator under the GDPR. As always, if you find these videos useful, if you find this content interesting, please do make sure that you subscribe to the channel. I think 75% of the people watching these videos are not yet subscribed, so make sure you hit that subscribe button. Hit the little notification bell as well, and that will let you know when videos are getting released. And also comment down below, like the videos, just do anything, engage with the content, and that helps show YouTube that this stuff is interesting and people are watching it. And to be honest, it just really helps us out. But for now, let's get on with what we want to talk about today. So today we are talking about reporting security incidents. Now everybody knows, or most people will know, certainly watching this channel, that under the GDPR, you have 72 hours in which to report a security incident to a regulator, security incident, security breach to the regulator. Now, the interesting conversation that comes up around this and the question that we very often get asked is, we have had an incident or we have had a suspected incident or breach. Do we need to report that to the regulator? And can you help us understand what the reporting requirements are and whether or not this particular incident needs to be reported? Now, the first thing to point out here is that under Article 33, where we talk about incident reporting and reporting breaches to the supervisory authority, the GDPR is fairly explicit, and it actually starts off by saying that all incidents should be reported to the regulator, and it should be done within 72 hours, etc., etc., etc. And then it finally says, unless the incident or the breach is unlikely to result in harm to the rights or freedoms of a specific individual. So it's interesting that they already take it from the approach that all incidents should be reported, and then they caveat it by saying unless. And this is where, when you're looking at whether or not you need to report a particular incident to the regulator, this is where you should start. By starting on the basis that you need to report, it's a lot easier to work your way backwards, look at the incident, look at what's happened, and look at the potential impact on the individuals to decide whether or not you can back away from that reporting. That is, of course, not to say that the first thing you do is report the incident to the regulator and then work out whether or not you should have done it. But that is to say that when you're looking at whether or not an incident is reportable, start on the basis that it is, and then work your way back down and determine whether or not that it actually has to be reported. Now, the best way to do this is obviously to take the incident at face value from the very start. So if an incident is reported to you, if an issue is reported through your current reporting structures, then treat that from the beginning as a reportable incident until you have determined otherwise. The reason I say that is because it keeps the mind fresh. It keeps the attitude of the people involved in the incident on the right place. If people start to become complacent, start thinking, oh, actually, it's not as important as we thought it might be, then the level of effort and the level of interaction that you're going to get in dealing with that incident can start to come down. The next thing that you need to do is make sure that you are documenting absolutely everything about the incident, when it happened, where it happened, how it happened, how many people were affected, what kind of information was released within the incident or released within the breach, what is the potential impact that the release of that information could have on a specific individual, who gained access to it, what could they have potentially done with it. Once you've started to understand that level of detail and that level of information, you can then start to risk assess those different factors. So let's say you lost 100,000 customer records, and those customer records were primarily first name. So you lost 100,000 people's first name and the first 4 letters of their postcode. So what you've got there is you've got a large volume of information. Now, initially, that's going to look quite scary and it's going to look like quite a severe incident. But when you start drilling down into it, you realize you've only got the first name. Now, being able to identify an individual from a first name is usually very unlikely unless you have a very distinct first name. You then have the first 4 letters of a postcode. That will generally give you a fairly wide area. Postcode around here, for instance, is CV37. That will give you a fairly broad spectrum covering Coventry, Stratford, parts of Leamington, Warwick and alike. So by taking a first name and the first part of the postcode, you're already realising that the likelihood of there being an impact to the rights or freedoms of an individual is quite low. Then, once you've done that, you can start to look at the potential impact on those individuals. Now, let's take the same scenario. So let's say we have 100,000 records, but this time we're not just talking about first name and postcode. Let's say we're talking about first name, surname, partial address, maybe town and postcode, but no contact details, no other real information. Again, the amount of information is quite large and it is quite interesting, but what is the potential impact on the risk or freedoms of the individual? Again, it's unlikely to be particularly significant because a lot of that information is probably available out on the public domain anyway. That information being released or being gained by somebody is not going to really give them a lot of information to be able to use against somebody. Nobody's really going to suffer any harm. Now let's take that same set of information, but this time we're going to have full name, address, maybe a telephone number, but more importantly this time we're going to have some information about their criminal history. What you've now got is a much more sensitive set of information. You've added some special category information in there. Now, the likelihood that an individual may suffer an impact to their rights or freedoms has greatly increased. You are now looking at what those kind of criminal convictions were, what that kind of criminal history is, and what's the impact on that information being out in the world, and how is that information going to impact that individual. In that kind of instance, you're now looking more likely to have to report that to the regulator, but also to the individuals affected so that they can start to take appropriate steps. The same process should be given when you're looking at financial information, so banking information, credit card details, payment details, medical records, anything to do with religious or political beliefs potentially. When you start to add those things in, you have to start looking at the potential harm that an individual could receive as a result of this information being released. The other thing to consider is that potential harm doesn't necessarily have to mean emotional distress. It could be a financial impact. Excuse me. It could be stress related. It could be information relating to somebody who doesn't want to be found by a partner, by a spouse, by a family member. It could be relating to a child who has been adopted and the original parents aren't supposed to know where this child is. So you have to start looking at the potential that the information has to cause harm to the individual. And only once have you worked down that list can you really determine whether or not an incident should be reported. The other thing to point out here is that, of course, you only have 72 hours from the point with which you identified that there had been a potential incident or breach within which to inform the regulator. Now, sometimes it is far better, especially if it is a potentially very large breach or large incident or involving particularly sensitive information. It is far better to inform the ICO and get that breach notification in, and then follow it up later on with information about why there wasn't a breach or why the incident wasn't so severe, than it is to try and wait and do all of your research and all of your insight in 72 hours so that you can make the determination later on. The reason we sometimes recommend that approach, and it's not always a commercially favourable approach, but the reason we recommend that is it buys you much more time. You're no longer constrained by that 72-hour period. You can do a much more detailed and thorough investigation. And also, just because you've reported something doesn't necessarily mean the breach is as serious as you may have first thought, and there's nothing stopping you going back to the ICO and back to your case handler and saying, actually, we've looked at this in more detail. We don't believe this incident was as serious as we first expected. And that allows you to withdraw and pull back from any position of concern. So the key here is, number one, not all incidents need to be reported to the regulator, but all incidents should be well documented, well managed, risk assessed and understood by your organisation before you decide not to report them to the regulator. And of course, it's always important to make sure that you're keeping a record of incidents internally within your organisation, because that's good for continual improvement and it's good for your own business processes and good business practices. And on the other flip side of the coin, just because you have 72 hours within which to report doesn't necessarily mean that you should always utilize that entire 72 hours. If you have concerns, if you are really concerned that an incident may be sizable, it may be serious, and there may be a large number of people potentially suffering some serious consequences, get that report in, make that notification early doors, and then you can always go back and fill in the blanks later on. But take your time carrying out the investigation and make sure that you've got all of the details rather than just trying to cram stuff into that 72-hour window, which isn't always appropriate. Now, I'm sure there's going to be some discussion around this. There is a lot more that we can talk about when we're looking at incident reporting, much more than I would want to put into a video on this particular channel. Obviously, if you have any questions, if you have any insights, or you want to raise any points, please do get in touch or drop your comments down below. And obviously we get back to every comment that we receive. As always though, this video is fairly succinct. So if you do find this content useful, if you find this kind of style interesting and you want to see more, please do make sure that you hit that subscribe button, hit the like button as well, and let us know in the comments if you have any questions. We look forward to speaking to you again very soon. Thanks very much.